The talk today is going to be talking about color, but I'm talking primarily summer color. And the reason for that is I think all too often, many of our gardens in the South are spring gardens. We have those, what I call a one-season wonder. Everything is in bloom in the spring. It's daffodils, dogwoods, and azaleas, and they are show places. And then we get into the summer and the fall and winter, and we have nothing of color. So I think color is important in a garden. So I think it makes it, oops, that went really fast. It makes it very interesting. I think when you have a garden, and I know that green is a color, but when I'm talking color, I'm thinking brighter colors in the garden. And we can do that with so many different things. You know, we can do it with bulbs. How many of you have been to Keukenhof in Holland to see the bulb display? It is absolutely stunning. And to think that garden, it is only a one-season wonder. It's only open for about 8 weeks a year. And it is just millions and millions of bulbs. So that sea of purple you see is all grape hyacinths. And so they try to make it like a river. But you go there and you're just in awe of every one of those gardens, but it's not open the rest of the year. But we can also get it with foliage. That garden there on the right is all herbs. It's very attractive, but it's colorful foliage that's doing that. But we can also get color with bark and even with berries. So beautyberry or calocarpa is probably the signature plant at our botanical garden in Arkansas. That is everywhere. It's a native plant, but when it's got the berries on it, people just go nuts. What is that plant? And it's easy to grow and gives us great color in the fall. And the coral bark maple, but people plant those when they're young little trees, and it's absolutely stunning with that color, and they never prune them, and they grow up and they turn brown. So I think just like a yellow twig dogwood or a red twig dogwood, you have to keep pruning it because the younger bark is where we get the color. And then think about bracts. You know, you all know the poinsettia. The true flower there is that tiny little yellow thing in the center. The showy part is the modified leaf or a bract. And this oregano Kent Beauty is beautiful in the garden. It's not, you don't use it as an edible herb, but it's very showy. The true flower on that is actually that tiny little purple thing there in the center. Our bougainvillea, which do so well down here in the South, the true flower is that little white thing in the center. It's a modified leaf or a bract that is so showy. But you know, we do travel a lot. I take Master Gardener groups all over the country, all over the world. And so we've gone to many places, like your Texas bluebonnets. We can't grow them very well, so we don't see that very often. I have had lupin envy for many years. You know, you go see those in Europe or in New Zealand and you go, oh, gotta have that. But they hate the South. So you have to go around and find out what works. And you're lucky that you have someone like Dave Creech who goes around the world and brings back plants that he trials here to tell you whether or not they're going to do well in your yard. But I think we have to branch out and not just plant azaleas and hollies and dogwoods in our yards. We need to try some things that are a little bit different to add some pizzazz or some color. And again, think about the seasons. In the South, we are able to have an extended gardening season. Now, last year was colder than normal for most of us, and so it wasn't necessarily the prettiest year for us. In fact, I helped host the National Azalea Society meeting in Little Rock in April. And it was the first weekend in April, and they were thinking, this may be a little late even for the color. It's the first time in my 38-year career that we were touring azalea farms with snow on the plants. It was snowing and sleeting in April. So we've had a very unusual year in Arkansas. But the seasonal color, that's P. Allen Smith's place up in outside of Little Rock, Moss Mountain. And that would be a beautiful home, a beautiful setting, but it's even more so with the amount of color that he plants every season. Now, I think one of the things you need to think about when you're adding color is that don't dilute it. You know, we don't live in a botanical garden, so we need to think about where we can make the biggest impact with that color. And I guess the best analogy is a bag of daffodil bulbs. People go out and they'll buy 100 bulbs, which seems like a lot to them. And then they'll bring them home and they'll line them up like soldiers. So you drive by and you see this one line of yellow in the yard, and you go, oh, that's kind of nice. But if they took that 100 bulbs and planted them in one big block, you'd drive by and it would be a massive color and you'd go, wow, look at that. So the same thing is true when you're putting out seasonal color or even perennials. Instead of putting one of these and one of those, plant in mass. And don't dilute it by spreading it all over the yard. Concentrate where it's going to make the biggest impact and people are going to see it the most. So there's your bold statements of color, and that's what we want to see. So let's talk about some summer annuals. You know, I just came from Overton a few weeks ago. Did anybody go to the trials over there to see those? Geraniums. Didn't you love the geraniums? I think geraniums are a very poor choice for the South. And every year I have plant breeders that say, oh, this one is really heat tolerant. This is going to do great. Well, compare our heat-tolerant geraniums in July and August to those you see in Alaska and Michigan. They've got flowers like this, and ours are struggling with the bloom like this. So choose plants that are going to take you all season, that will take the heat that we dish out, that will take some drier conditions. But I still think probably for most of these plants it's going to be better if we give them a little water. Cosmos is one that can take the heat. If you've not tried Alternanthera, that is a great foliage plant. It comes in a lot of different colors. You may know it as Joseph's coat, but that one up there on the right is called Party Time. That thing can get almost 3.5 feet tall. And the new foliage that comes on is that hot, vibrant pink. But you can get them, this little ruby stays very compact. If you've ever been to a garden that has the name of the garden written in plants, it's usually Joseph's coats or Alternanthera they're doing it with. They're heat tolerant, they're drought tolerant, and a lot of different colors to choose from. Coleus, I think in my tenure working in horticulture, there are a few plants that have made a strong comeback. Coleus is one of them. You know, think back 25 years ago, you bought a 6-pack of Coleus with 6 different colors, and if you weren't pinching the top, they had those little purple flowers on them, and they were spindly and ugly. Most of these new ones are not going to even initiate blooms until late in the summer or early fall, and some never at all. Wasabi is brilliant. Now, I planted wasabi last year in a pot. I had a pretty good sized pot, so I had a wasabi, a mandevilla, and a lantana. You didn't see anything with the wasabi. It got this tall, this big around, and I hardly did anything to that plant all summer long. So a lot of color with a little bit of impact. So know the difference if it will take full sun or partial shade or deep shade. And some can do all three. The Kufias have really come into their own lately. Now, you may not know that word Kufia, or you may have heard of bat-faced Kufia, but I bet you all know Mexican heather. That was a Kufia. And it's one of the most drought-tolerant annuals we have, but the flowers were so small, it didn't make much of an impact in the garden. This vermilion air is one of our chosen plants for this season. I think it's stunning. It's the new variety for cigar plant. This thing is going to get up to be about, I saw one last year that was over 4 feet tall and 4 feet across, covered with hummingbirds and butterflies. The hotter it gets, the better it performs, and the more sun it gets. Bat-faced Kufia, of course, is great. And then you've got the Sriracha series, and these have flowers about the size of a quarter. The hotter it gets, the better they bloom. They come in pink, orange, or red. And don't forget impatiens. You know, a lot of growers quit even trying to push impatiens because we had some issues with some diseases. We had downy mildew. We haven't had that much problem in Arkansas with it. This is still probably your best annual for deep shade. If you have deep shade to light shade, there's nothing like an impatient. You've got to water those. So if you live in an area, and I was worried about water coming down here because my sister lives in Arlington, Texas, and they have had water restrictions where they could water only certain days of the week, and they had to be very careful about washing their cars or running water of any sort. This is one that won't take it if it's too dry. So this one does need water, but a lot of colors that it comes in. But how many of you have tried the sun patience? Now, there's been mixed reviews across the South. In Little Rock, well, in Arkansas in general, we're doing great in full sun with sun patience. In fact, I'm trialing some of the sun patience and some of the New Guinea varieties that are touted as sun-loving impatiens. Now, when the first New Guineas came out that said sun-loving, they would take the sun if you stood next to them with a garden hose. These new sun patience, it's average water. I'm doing really well with them in full sun to partial shade. I think in deep shade they do not bloom as well. But the flowers are huge. And last year, when we had some light freezes, my common impatiens were gone. These went until I had a heavy frost. So they went all the way through December for me. Lantanas, I have heard that you all have put lantana on the invasive plant list in Texas. Is that true?
It is true, and it's related to the modern varieties.
Well, you know, so many. Well, lantana is one of the most heat-tolerant plants you've got, but there are so many varieties. And one of the things you need to do if you're putting out lantana is know the mature size, because we've got some that at maturity are very compact, and then we've got some at maturity that are huge. I mean, that's a master gardener in Mississippi last fall, and that's a lantana plant. So that's how large they can get with some varieties. But put these out in full sun. The newer varieties are self-cleaning. If you see that word with your annuals or perennials, it means they don't set seed. So you're not going to have the problem of having to get out there and deadhead them, and they're not going to come up from seed all over the yard either. Pentas, I think it's one of the best plants for hummingbirds and butterflies. I like the red the best. You know, there's lots of colors to choose from, but they will bloom all summer long with relatively little care, and I've never seen any insects or diseases on them. But this is the new sweet potato vine, and I've seen quite a few on campus when we were driving around today. You know, the hotter it gets, the better they do. The biggest complaint we've had from gardeners over the years is it gets too big. They just take over the garden. They're a monster. This year, they're coming out with compact varieties of sweet potato vines. And instead of just those two choices of Marguerite and Blackie, look at the varieties that you can choose from and look at the patterns you can get. So there's lots of new choices with sweet potato vines. They love the South. Don't plant them too early, but they will take you from mid-May all the way up through fall and give you lots and lots of color. But I think probably, having been to so many plant things lately in Texas, this is probably the best annual for Texas. I have seen such great results with this, and there's a lot of new varieties. Now, I love weird color combinations. There's a series coming out, I think it's from Ball, and it's called Tattoo. This is a tattoo variety. When we were out in California this spring looking at these varieties, it was stunning. But unfortunately, it is not disease resistant. So it gets that stem canker. So it's not something that could be planted out in the garden. It would have to be in pots. But they sent me some to trial, and they're doing great this summer. So this is one that once you get it established for an annual, they might get really, really dry and kind of curl a little bit. You give them some water and they bounce right back. So stunning color, great use for the garden in the South. And that's just some of the different varieties. And the other thing I love are zinnias. In fact, Profusion came on the market, everybody fell in love with Profusion. I like the Zaharas better. I think they have a little bit bigger flower to them. The double orange is stunning. And again, the warmer it gets, the more they spread and the better that they grow. So you can get a lot of color, and they'll take you all the way through frost as well. But don't forget about tropicals. What do tropical plants thrive in? Heat and humidity. And what do we have in abundance right now? So these are plants, and if you move your house plants outside for the summer, don't group them all on the patio where you have to water them every day. Stick them out in your flower beds. You can leave them in those pots, but if you've got a sprinkler system, they're watered for you. Put them out in the shade. They give you lots of different colors and textures, and then just clean them up before you move them back inside in the fall. I buy crotons. I go to Home Depot and can get 5 or 6 crotons for $8 a piece. Put those out. They've got a thick leaf to them. They've got a lot of color. The more sun they get, the more vibrant the colors are, and they will last up until a killing frost, and then I just throw them away and buy new the next year. Bougainvilleas. Don't put these out in the garden and plant them, because if you do and they've got unrestricted root growth, you get a big old plant and very few flowers. They tend to bloom a whole lot better if they are pot bound. So keep them in a more limited space. Do know that they have some thorns on them, so beware of that. The Crossandra, this used to be sold in the grocery store for indoor color as a house plant that you'd grow for a couple of months and throw it away. I plant it outside in the shade garden, and that gives me color all summer long, and lots of it with either orange or yellow in color. And then you guys do really well with this. It will not overwinter for us in central Arkansas north unless it's a really, really mild winter. But Esperanza or Tacoma and bright yellow gives you lots of color, blooms its heart out. But how many of you have tried the orange one? It does not bloom as well for me at all. I bought one, it was in full bloom, it was beautiful for about a week or two, and that was it. I got a scattered bloom the rest of the summer. So for me, the orange bells, which is a cross, does not do as well, and that Cape honeysuckle one here on the left, it's great for a short season. It's not gonna last me all summer either, so I would go with the solid yellow. I buy tropical hibiscus all the time. I have them in pots on the deck. I have them in pots in my gardens, but I also get some of the smaller ones and plant them as bedding plants. Put them in the ground, fertilize them every week or two. They will bloom nonstop and give you loads of color. And people talk about how expensive they are. I don't think they're that expensive for as much color as you get and how long they last. Now, I also don't move them inside in the fall. And I had a master gardener come up to me and she said, well, Janet, you know, some of us are retired and we don't have the unlimited budget you must have to buy plants. Well, her husband bought a pack of cigarettes a day. She went to Starbucks 3 or 4 times a week. I said, I don't smoke and I make my own coffee. So that's my Starbucks and my cigarettes. And for me to buy $15, $20 for a plant that's gonna last you for 5 months, that's a bargain. And if you save them from year to year, they don't bloom as well the next year unless you prune them way back, you root prune them, repot them, and most people don't do that. They move them outside, they water and fertilize, and they have a green plant and they complain they don't bloom. So buy some new ones, the colors are stunning, but do fertilize. The hardy hibiscus, so many new varieties, so many variables in size. I took a picture yesterday. We have a rain garden at our state extension office, and we put in 2 little Texas red stars. They were about this big 3 years ago, and today those plants are probably 20 feet tall and 20 feet across because they're in where they love, full sun and lots of water. So these are plants, and then the Confederate rose that blooms in the fall of the year. You know, that thing will grow up to be 8 to 10 feet tall or more in one season, but you don't get the flowers until fall. They die back in the winter, but they come back the next year. The firebush, Hamelia patens, is a great plant. Tiny little flowers there and a showy bract, and that will bloom all summer long and attract butterflies and hummingbirds. And Ixora. You know, sometimes when these big chain stores come in, they have a plant buyer that buys for a region. Well, we had a Home Depot that went into an area in Arkansas, and they opened in the fall of the year or late summer, and they had tons of Ixora out by the shrubs. All these people assumed they were shrubs and planted them, and they called me up in January and they said, well, they look kind of bad right now. Are they not supposed to be evergreen? I said, they're supposed to be tropical, so they're dead. They're not going to come back. But there's some beautiful color, and that will bloom all summer long. There's some new yellow ones as well as orange. But talk about different varieties coming out. Mandevillas, everybody's coming out with a new color. You know, it used to be just pink, and then it came pink or red. Now we've got white, we've got stars and stripes, which is red and white stripes. We've got sort of that apricot peachy one. There are bushy ones and compact ones, and there's the vigorous vining ones. But these can give you a ton of color, thicker, fleshier leaf, so they're much more drought tolerant than some of the others as well. And the yellow shrimp plant, this is a better plant to put in a semi-shady area. Don't put this one out in full sun, but that's also the true flowers, that little white thing that's popping out of that yellow bract. And how many of you have ever been to Hawaii and gone to a convenience store there and you see the little plastic bag with this dead-looking stick in it, and you bring that home and you put that in soil and it becomes this beautiful showy plumeria plant. And you can bring that in. We've got gardeners that just stack them. I had a gentleman that lived in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and he was from Hawaii, and he had probably 50 plumerias in his yard. And he would plant them out in the spring after the soil temperature warmed up, and then in the fall, he would move them to stack them in his garage, bare root, and they would put them back out the next year. And if you'd go to his house, end of July, early August, it looked like you were in Hawaii. I mean, you could make lays out of that. There's a deer walking through the garden right over there. It can go eat your plants, Dave. Seriously. The tapioca plant, that's one that you're going to get great foliage color with, but it's just vigorous, and I have tried to overwinter. It does not work. Dave said they don't work down here overwintering either, but that does give you just a lot of color. And the Tibushina, how many grow this? It's a fabulous plant. Now, there are some varieties that are winter hardy. So after a killing frost, let it go through a killing frost, add an extra layer of mulch around it, and give it a shot. It might come back. But that's a beautiful, real fuzzy, velvety kind of bloom. Let's talk about some summer bulbs. Caladiums. They're cheap, they're easy, they're not going to come back unless you lift and store them. But I will buy, when they go on sale in June or early July even, I'll buy a bag of caladiums. I work up the soil, throw them out, cover them with some soil, and within a week I've got caladium bulbs up and growing. Now, if you want them to be bigger and fuller, you DI them. You get in there and you scoop out the center so the buds come out and be a little bit more uniform. I just toss them all out in the yard and they do just fine. If you want to store them for the next year, you can. I usually just buy new ones every year. Cannas, there are now seed-grown cannas. There's bulb cannas. There's all kinds of them. Many people are growing them for the foliage versus the flowers. Tropicana and Bengal tiger give you tons of color. And I've seen so many crinums on my drive down here. You know, I kind of think it's the ugly duckling of the plant world. You know, it's that ugly foliage and then those fabulous blooms that come up. But the flowers can just be stunning. And daylilies. You know, the problem I would say with daylilies is be careful. Because I have so many gardeners that started off with 1 or 2, and they now have 1,000 or 2,000 daylilies in their yard, and they're constantly buying more. So we have daylily societies all over Arkansas. But so many colors to choose from, and pretty easy to take care of. And the elephant ears, again, we're getting more and more varieties of elephant ears all the time in just a huge range of colors and sizes. But this is one I really recommend. The ginger lilies, why don't we grow more of these? This is something that blooms for us at the end of the summer. It's fragrant, it's as sweet smelling as gardenias, and it's so easy to grow, and they multiply. So the tall white butterfly ginger is great. The tall orange ginger is fabulous, and it has a real faint fragrance to it. There are lower growing gingers, so there's a whole range of these. Don't give them full sun. They're going to do much better where they get morning sun and afternoon shade. A little bit of protection for us does a little bit better. And liatris or gay feather. You can see these growing on the interstate. So if you can see them growing on their own, think how well they'll do in your garden. There are tall ones, there are dwarf ones. You can buy the plants at nurseries right now, but you can also buy the little corms and put those out. And they're a great perennial. They'll come back year after year. But this year, at least in Arkansas, the lilies have been spectacular. And they will multiply as well. Now, many of our lilies, especially if you've got the taller ones, you will need to help stake them. Put some perennial stakes out there to help to support them and keep them upright, but they have just been fabulous. Now, people ask all the time, well, can I cut them back as soon as they're done? When the foliage begins to die back, you don't have to wait for it to go all the way to the ground. Their season is pretty well over. But they're going to come back. The Oriental ones are probably the showiest, I think. But the Asiatic have the widest range of colors to choose from. And then the Madonna lilies have those giant candlesticks of seed pods even after they bloom. And then the tiger lilies. Now, those get really tall. So you've got to put those towards the back of your garden. But they're showy as well. And lycoris. I did a radio show, call-in radio show for 28 years in Arkansas on a Saturday, and I had a producer, and we had a kill button so that if somebody said something inappropriate, they could kill it. Well, that didn't happen but twice in my 28 years, but this gentleman called in, he said, Janet, I have 28 naked ladies in my backyard. And so he thought he's getting ready to kill it. And I said, no, he's talking about a plant, or at least I hope he is. But so naked ladies are the ones that we typically call the pink ones up there, the squamigera. But the foliage on those comes up very early in the spring, and then it dies back, and those flowers just magically appear. And then the radiata there on the right, many people call that the surprise lily or the magic lily. It comes up typically in the fall. But those are the most common. But there are yellows, there are oranges, there's all kinds of these. Just remember where you plant them. In fact, if you plant a lot of things like this or spring ephemerals that come up and they're gone, what I do is I have a bag of golf tees in my bag, in my gardening kit, and I'll just put a golf tee down next to where I've planted them. So when I'm buying a plant and I'm putting it out in the garden and I come across a golf tee, I can move over 12 inches so I don't damage that bulb digging it up and putting something else there. Let's talk about some other perennials. Everybody's talking about this plant, the milkweeds, Asclepias. We gotta have them, because we gotta have monarchs. There's lots of milkweeds out there right now blooming. Orange by far is the most showy, but there are yellow ones. There's some other native ones as well. Talk about a heat lover, the hyssops or the agastache, or agastachy, some people call it. But the native one was originally called just the giant blue hyssop. It had a blue or purple flower to it. Today you can get yellows, oranges, pinks, whites, you name it, you've got it. And this one, talk about showy. It's almost gaudy, it's so showy. This Pride of Barbados, this one can get a little bit gangly or wild and woolly in the garden, but there's a compact variety as well, and it's blooming right now in the garden and will give you lots and lots of color. Coreopsis, they were talking with the trials I went to, and Dave was saying it today too, that many of your Coreopsis don't last forever here. For us in Arkansas, we do pretty well. You know, I deadhead Coreopsis up until about the end of August, and after that they pretty much quit blooming for us. And then I let them set seeds because the best time for them to reseed will be in the fall. But there's lots and lots of new varieties. Now I think with anything, whether it was the Echinacea or the Coreopsis, when they first hit the market with all these wild colors, they did not perform as well as our native yellows or purples or whatever we had. But the salsa has done extremely well. I think they're learning through plant breeding how to do better with some of these variable colors now, and I think we're doing really well. Coneflower is the one I was really talking about, though. When they first came out, there were yellows and oranges and double reds and all kinds of things. They were annuals almost. They did not perform very well as perennials the first few years. Now through plant breeding, they're doing fantastic. So we've got oranges, we've got yellows, we've got whites, we've got some double flowers that are there. Deadheading is something you do have to do with Echinacea for them to bloom, but this is probably the longest blooming perennial we grow in the garden. It'll start flowering for us in May or early June, and we still have flowers on it in October. As they start to fade, and what, you know, people ask me all the time, where should I do that deadheading? Well, it depends on how much time you have. In my yard, I don't have a lot of time. So I often even will get the hedge trimmers and just whack the whole top of it and move on. If you have time, where the flower is spent, if you follow that stem back to where the next node is, that's where you should cut it to, because that stem is going to die back to that, and that's where the new buds are going to initiate. Oh yes, they'll just keep on flowering. If you don't deadhead, they're going to set seeds. We used to have a gentleman in Arkansas who was the wildflower guru. Well, his goal was to have as many wildflower seeds produced to populate the world with wildflowers. In my garden, I want to see as many flowers in my garden for that season, and I'll worry about seeds at the end of the year. And October, I think, is the best time anyway. Gaillardia. I noticed a white Gaillardia out here. I've never seen a white Gaillardia.
You get to take one home.
Oh, yay. I love Gaillardia. That's one that you really need to deadhead as well. But, you know, the original one is this. Oh, what did I just do? I just turned the color. Okay, this one was the original with that yellow kind of orange and red combination. But today we've got yellows, we've got solid reds, we've got oranges, and obviously we have whites. That is a heat lover. It's a wildflower from Oklahoma, so you know it can take the heat and the drought. Gara. This was what I call an explosion in the garden. And so to me, if you had a large garden, it worked. But if you had a relatively small garden, it just got too big and too wild. They've come out now, and you know, when one company does, they all do, it seems like. But they've come out with dwarf Gara. So there are compact plants now that will fit in a garden a little bit easier. They bloom in white or pink, but that's some of the new ones up there. They're not supposed to get any taller than 2.5 feet tall by 2.5 feet wide. But they bloom all summer. Again, the hotter the drier, and butterflies and bees love them. Seen tons of this while I've been down here. Turk's turban or Malva viscus in the hibiscus family. fabulous perennial. It will multiply, it will spread. Just learn to recognize it and share it with your friends. This is another one you may share with your friends. Rudbeckia. This is one, the black-eyed Susan. You know, you will see some of these green-eyed Susans like Irish Eyes or these giant ones. They're more of an annual. They're not going to be a great perennial. For us, we're still looking at Gold Sturm as being one of the best varieties of black-eyed Susans because they can get powdery mildew in our climate where it's so humid. But they will bloom off and on all summer into fall as well. Be careful with Ruellia. The Mexican petunia, the dwarf one, is very well behaved. It will give you tons of color. It comes in purple, pink, or white. The standard one can get 5 feet tall or more, and it will take over a garden. So it's a beautiful flower. It's very drought tolerant, but be careful. It can be a bit aggressive. And I think there's a lot of folks in love with salvias. There's tons and tons of new salvias. You know, I've got salvias in my garden, but I mean, I don't want all salvias in my garden. But where I think they'd shine is in the fall. You know, if you think about many salvias now will bloom and rest and bloom and rest all summer. But even those that just bloom once, they'll bloom in the fall. Think of pineapple sage, fabulous red color in the fall. So try some of these, especially if you need some help in that late season garden, and butterflies and bees are all over these. But you can find a color of flowers in any color you want, from yellows to true blues to purples, whites, and pinks. Now let's talk about just a few shrubs. This is one of the really tough performers in the garden, and I'm glad to see that some of these older plants are now coming back with new varieties. So the Althea or the Rose of Sharon, lots of new colors out there. You can make it a standard one-stem pom-pom if you want to in the garden. You can have it as a large shrub or even a small tree in the garden. And so lots and lots of color, full sun to partial shade. They bloom all summer long and just tough as nails. Most of the new varieties are also self-cleaning. They don't set seeds like the old-fashioned ones where every seed brought a seedling underneath it. So really some nice new opportunities. Same thing with butterfly bush or buddleia. You know, if you think about the South, at least in Arkansas, our most invasive plants are going to be privet, kudzu, bamboo if you plant it. But if you go up into the northeastern United States, their privets were buddleia, burning bush euonymus, and barberries. So they were kind of banning these plants. They didn't want to plant any more of them. So now all of the new varieties are really seedless, and they come in a wide range of colors from purples, pinks, and whites. There are dwarf varieties and even micro dwarf varieties, but they will attract a lot of butterflies as well. The bottle brush, a showstopper in the garden. Standard ones can get up to be 6 to 8 feet tall. There's dwarf varieties now that don't get more than 3 to 4 feet in height. But this one is limited how far north it can go. It doesn't do well in Arkansas overwintering. And crepe myrtles, you know, a lot of people are getting worried about crepe myrtles with that crepe myrtle bark scale. You know, research is going on all over the South, trying to come up with what varieties are resistant, what kind of new chemicals could come out to control it. You know, but people are concerned. They're thinking it's killing their crepe myrtles. If you get that crepe myrtle bark scale and you ignore it, we don't know that it's going to kill it or not, but it's not going to bloom very well. It's going to definitely impact the growth. But there's a lot of research going on. But there are crepe myrtles now that are ground covers, very, very short, and of course all the way up to the graceful trees if they're not crepe myrtled. But lots of colors to choose from. I was talking to Dave about these as we were walking around looking at the gardens today. You know, hydrangea macrophylla, the big leaf hydrangea, that has been the one that everybody wants. And there's thousands of new varieties, it seems like, every year. These are not going to be drought tolerant plants. And in Arkansas, we struggle some years if they start growing because the macrophylla is not the smartest plant in our gardens. If we have 2 or 3 days of warm weather in January, they go, oh, spring is here, and they start growing, and a late freeze freezes them back to the ground. So in the northern tier of our state, they see a bloom about once every 5 years. So unless they're growing the reblooming forms like Lady in Red and what's the blue one? Endless Summer. Though they're not going to see flowers. But so for us, we're really struggling with some of these. Plus, right now, today it was 105 heat index at home. So even if they're planted in the proper location where they get morning sun and afternoon shade, they still look really sad. They're wilting every day. The oak leaf hydrangeas, we're seeing a lot of new varieties of those. They're not quite as finicky as the big leaf hydrangea, but I'm switching over to more of the panicle hydrangeas. The paniculatas can go in full sun. They're not going to wilt every day like the macrophyllus, and it doesn't matter what kind of winter I have, they bloom on the new growth. Now, when strawberry vanilla came out, have you tried any of these, Dave? Well, for us in the South, they're vanilla. There's no strawberry to them. I planted it, and mine is absolutely stunning, covered in white flowers, but the first 2 years, I had white flowers, and I kept waiting for that hot pink to come on, and I talked to the plant breeder. I said, when is this pink color going to come? And she said, when it's cool. Well, it's not cool when my hydrangeas are blooming. So in Arkansas, we're just calling them vanilla. But they're covered in blooms. That's one of them right there on the left. And the first couple of years, they're a little bit floppy. They're kind of laying over, but this is probably its 5th year, but these are not little plants, folks. This one that I have is in full sun, and it's in its 4th or 5th year, and right now it's probably 6 or 7 feet tall and about 8 feet across. But it's covered in white flowers. So these are going to be much stronger performers if you're looking for a tougher or more durable plant. Oleander, that's one that's tough as nails. We'll come back every year. We had a little bit of winter damage this year, but it is poisonous, so be careful. But if you live in an area where deer are a problem, that can give you lots of color, and they'll leave it alone. The roses. I was just at our state capitol yesterday in Little Rock, which used to be one of the All-American Rose Society's testing sites. They've done away with that program now, but they still have the rose gardens. And unfortunately, their staff has no clue what to do with those roses. And so they look hideous, but they're all hybrid teas. Well, hybrid teas have to be pruned severely every year. And they were pruning them about this far back every year. So there are stalks like this. So they have foliage from here to here if they have leaves, and then dead-looking stalks the rest of the way. But you have to spray them every week if you're going to keep black spot away. Many of these new, they call them earth-kind roses, are going to do a whole lot better for us. But are they completely disease-resistant? How many of you have had problems with knockouts? Knockouts this year were probably the prettiest we've ever had them in Arkansas. They were stunning, which means more people have planted them. But they do need to be pruned. They can get Cercospora leaf spot, but they can give you a lot of color. I love the drift roses. They're low growing, they bloom all summer, give them a haircut once in the spring, and you're good to go. And I mean, lots of people still plant bridal wreath spirea. I think it's in bloom for 2 weeks and it's kind of boring. But I love the summer spireas. They will bloom for me off and on 3 or 4 times all summer. Shear them back before growth begins in the spring, and then shear them, just periodically deadhead them, and they will just bloom all summer long. In full sun to partial shade, a lot more color than bridal wreath. And then your Texas sage. Pretty even with the foliage, but then you've got those pretty flowers. It can get a little floppy sometimes. You might need to give it a little bit of a haircut. The chase tree, it's really coming on strong. It's become one of the most popular summer flowering large bushes or small trees in Arkansas. And it's in full bloom right now. So choose plants that can take the heat, but also choose plants that fit your yard. You know, drive around, get ideas from people, travel, look at the plant trials, see what does well, but think outside the box. Don't have a cookie cutter approach to landscaping where every yard looks the same with the same plants every year. Know what kind of soil you have, know what the drainage is. You know, one of the things we always tell people is dig a hole the depth you're planting that plant, fill it with water and see how long it takes to drain. Do that in the winter. If you do it now, you might stand there all day waiting for whole water. But it should go down about 1 inch per hour. If you still have water sitting in that hole at the end of a day, you know, every time it rains, your plants are swimming. So think about the drainage beneath the soil level, not just at the top. Oops. Water, know how much your plants need. Some are very drought tolerant, some need a lot. So group those plants together that need the same conditions. Don't put an azalea next to a cactus. one of them's not going to be happy. And then fertilizer. When we talk about fertilization, I think sometimes we overdo it when it comes to trees and shrubs. One application a year, or if you've prepared the site well, my plants don't get any fertilizer because they're growing too well as it is. But when it comes to annuals and tropicals, they're there one season. You want to push them. So I fertilize quite often. And people say, well, what do you use? I'm not so sure it's that important what you use. It's how often you're using it and the rate that you're using it. You know, sometimes people think if a little bit's good, a lot's going to be better. Plants will die from too much fertilizer. They're not going to get fat. So you need to be careful, especially when it's hot and dry outside. When you're putting out fertilizer, water well first. Make sure there's enough moisture in the plants, they're happy and healthy before you add that nutrition. And you don't need to buy a separate fertilizer for everything in your garden. This is tomato food. Here's my cactus food. Here's my African violet food. Here's my rose food. Here's my vegetable food. It's food. Fertilize with something that's fairly well balanced, and a little bit is better than too much. You can always add more. And then deadhead, or if the plants get leggy, give them a haircut. You know, especially if it's an annual. My motto is life is too short to live with bad plants. So if a plant is not doing well, throw it away. Buy a new one. You know, people will bring us in a plant that is 3/4 of the way dead. And they'll go, well, how can I revive this? Why? Unless it has some sentimental value, put it in the compost pile and put something new out there. And when you're replacing those plants, you don't have to plant the exact same thing that was there. Think again, what season does your garden need some help in? Try some of these new plants that Dave is introducing. Deadheading is simply, that's what we were talking about earlier, cutting off the flower. And if you can, follow that stem back to where the node is, and that's where it's going to branch back out, and that will have them blooming a whole lot faster. And think about yard art. That can add color in your garden as well. But sometimes it doesn't work as well as we think. This was a garden. You can't see the plants for all the yard art. And the backyard was worse than the front yard, believe it or not. Oops. So plant color and enjoy your garden. But remember, your garden or your landscape is also a reflection of who you are. So use the colors that you have. You know, when we teach landscape design or we teach all these things, we give you all these rules of landscaping. But if you walk outside into your garden and it makes you happy, that's what's important. So have fun with your garden and add color. So thank you all very much.